Welcome to this special LGBT History Month lecture. It's called The Long Road to LGBT Freedom, How We Got From There to Here. And I'd like to start by asking you to imagine how you would feel if you fell in love with someone and the law threatened you with life imprisonment. Well, that was my experience as a teenager, like you, growing up in the 1960s. Until 1967, the maximum penalty for sex between men was life imprisonment. And that was just the start. You could also be forced, persuaded, or pressured to undergo what was called aversion therapy to supposedly cure your homosexuality. I had a friend who was pressured by his family and church to undergo this aversion therapy in the 1960s. What it involved was that he was strapped into a chair in a hospital and then shown erotic images of gay men. And simultaneously with those images, he was given electric shocks through electrodes strapped to his arms, hands, chest, legs, and feet. Another variation of aversion therapy was to strap a man to a hospital bed, inject him with nausea-inducing drugs, and then show him erotic images of men. And the effect of those nausea-inducing drugs would make him urinate, defecate, and vomit. And he'd be left there covered in his own feces and vomit and urine for maybe 1 or 2 days. This was paid for by the British taxpayers and funded on the National Health Service, with an objective of curing and eradicating homosexuality. Of course, it didn't work, but the men who went through those processes were emotionally, psychologically, and sexually damaged for life. In addition, when I was growing up, you could be sacked from your job for simply being gay, or lesbian, or bisexual, or transgender. An employer could refuse to hire you because of your sexual orientation or gender identity. You could be refused service in shops, restaurants, cafes, bars, pubs. They could turn you away saying, "We're not serving puffs and lezzies here." If you were in rented accommodation, a landlord was legally entitled to refuse to rent you a property. And if he or she discovered you were LGBT, he could lawfully evict you without notice, without redress. In the 1960s, you could be expelled from school for being LGBT. And some kids were. Just for the fact that they were gay, they were expelled from their schools. In 1967, things began to change. We had the partial decriminalisation of male homosexuality in England and Wales. That wasn't extended until 1980 in Scotland, until 1982 in Northern Ireland. But it was a very partial, limited decriminalisation. Most aspects of gay male life remained criminal. But the maximum penalty went down from life imprisonment to 5 years. Full decriminalisation, the repeal of all the anti-gay laws affecting sexual relations, did not happen in England and Wales until 2003. 2003, just 15 years ago. The repeal did not happen in full in Northern Ireland until 2008, and not in Scotland until 2014. A mere 4 years ago. Until 1999, Britain had by volume the largest number of anti-gay laws of any country in the world, some of them dating back centuries. So, for example, the law against anal sex or anal intercourse was originally promulgated during the reign of King Henry VIII in 1533. 1533. And it wasn't repealed until 2003. Many of you will be familiar with the trial of Oscar Wilde. In 1895, he was sentenced to 2 years hard labour for so-called, quote, gross indecency with another man. What that simply meant was sexual contact with another man. As you know, that imprisonment effectively killed him. He died very soon after his release from prison. And that law, too, was only repealed in 2003. It had been on the statute books from 1885 to 2003, and it's estimated that at least 100,000 men were convicted under that law, the same law that sent Oscar Wilde to jail, the same law that led to Alan Turing, the great mathematician and computer genius, led to him being ordered by the courts to undergo chemical castration. This is in the early 1950s, not in the 1500s. In the early 1950s, one of the greatest geniuses of all time was ordered by the courts to undergo chemical castration as an alternative to prison. And ultimately, of course, it led to his tragic suicide. So it has been a very long, hard, painful road. I mentioned that until 1999, Britain had by volume the largest number of anti-gay laws of any country on earth. These included not only the unequal age of consent for gay and bisexual men, initially set at 21 in 1967, then reduced to 18 in 1994, and then reduced finally to 16, equal with heterosexual people, in 2001. Also, we had Section 28, which until 2003 prohibited me from giving talks like this in schools because it was seen to be condoning or glamorizing or encouraging or supporting same-sex relations, which was deemed unlawful. Up until 2002, 2003, it was unlawful for a same-sex couple to foster or adopt a child. That only changed just over a decade ago. It wasn't until 2003 that workplace protection was introduced, giving LGBT people protection against discrimination in the hiring and promotion and so on in the workplace. Up until that time, there was no legal protection against discrimination at work. We also saw in 1999, which was the first major reform, an end to the ban on LGBT people serving in the armed forces. Up until then, if you were LGBT, you weren't allowed to join the armed forces, and if you were discovered, you were dishonorably discharged, often after being sentenced to a military prison. And in the process of being discharged, you not only lost your job, but also your accommodation, because military personnel lived on military bases, and you often lost your pension, your friends, just about everything. We had finally the first recognition of same-sex relationships with the Civil Partnership Act, which came into force in 2005. The first legal recognition of people of the same gender who love each other. And that was followed up, of course, in 2014 with the legislation of same-sex marriage. Before then, in 2007, 2008, discrimination in the provision of goods and services, in housing, education, advertising, and so on, that was all outlawed. But until these changes, all this discrimination was not only lawful, but positively sanctioned by the law. The law backed anti-LGBT discrimination. So over the period 1999 to 2014, every major anti-LGBT law has been repealed. That's extraordinary. About 15 pieces of discriminatory legislation removed in the space of 15 years. The fastest, most successful law reform campaign in British history and possibly world history. I can't think of any other community who suffered so much legal discrimination and got it repealed in such a short space of time. And that's a huge tribute not only to LGBT people themselves who led that fight, but also to our much valued straight friends and allies who marched, walked and campaigned with us. So exactly how did we get from there to here? In the 1960s, there were organizations like the Homosexual Law Reform Society, which campaigned against criminalization and spearheaded the fight, the successful fight, to secure the 1967 Sexual Offences Act, which, as I said, was a partial, limited decriminalization. But the big real turning point was the formation of the Gay Liberation Front in 1970. Unlike previous homosexual law reform campaigners, the Gay Liberation Front had an agenda much bigger and broader than mere law reform. It was campaigning against anti-LGBT prejudice in the media, the church, Parliament and the government, the education system, advertising, popular entertainment. It had a much bigger, broader reach than the earlier campaigners. It was also the first time that the movement was actually led by out and proud LGBT people. The Gay Liberation Front was very open about our sexuality, and I was proud to be part of it. We didn't hide, we didn't pretend to be straight. It was the first time in Britain ever that thousands of LGBT people came out and marched and protested for their rights and their freedoms. That was a huge, huge sea change. The Gay Liberation Front had a very simple slogan: gay is good. It may seem so innocuous today, but back then it was revolutionary, because the prevailing consensus in the late 60s and early 70s was that gay was bad, mad, sad, sinful, criminal, immoral. So to defiantly assert that gay is good was a revolution in consciousness, not just in terms of mainstream straight society, but also in terms of LGBT culture itself. Back then, most LGBT people were closeted. They hid their sexuality because they feared criminalization, they feared rejection by their families, being sacked from their job, or being denied promotion, being refused accommodation, and so on. The Gay Liberation Front said, we cannot make any changes unless we are out and open, unless we declare ourselves, unless we show people we are everywhere, unless we show people by our example the positive contribution that we make to society, and unless we challenge prejudice in our daily lives. So we don't let homophobic, biphobic, or transphobic abuse pass unchallenged. We turn around and we challenge it. So one of the things that the Gay Liberation Front did was do a big campaign against pubs, bars, restaurants, and cafes that refused to serve LGBT people. We took our example, our model, from the Black Civil Rights Movement in America. Many of you will know that in the bad old days in the deep south of the United States in the 1950s and 60s, many restaurants, cafes, and other public utilities were segregated. Black people could not eat at a Woolworths lunch counter because that was reserved for whites only. They couldn't drink at whites-owned drinking fountains in parks and streets. They had to sit at the back of the bus or in segregated carriages and trains. And the black community in America rose up and said, no, we are going to demand an end to segregation, to demand equal service. And they engaged in a campaign of civil disobedience. They went to those places and demanded to be served, demanded to be seated. But we thought that's a very good tactic to use against those bars and cafes that refuse to serve LGBT people. So in West London, for example, there were a series of pubs that had a policy, we don't serve queers. So we decided, after a Gay Liberation Front meeting, to go en masse to this pub and demand to be served. So about 50 of us turned up and demanded drinks. We asked for whatever, lager or whatever we wanted, and we were told point blank, we're not serving you, you're queer, get out. So we sat down and refused to move. The landlord threatened to call the police. We said, fine, call the police. The police came, and it wasn't just your local bobbies, these were the heavy police, because the police regarded LGBT people as the enemy. We were the enemy within. We were seen as criminals. So we were very harshly treated by the police in those days. So I think about 4 or 5 police vans turned up with probably around about 30 to 40 officers and stormed into the pub and very roughly manhandled us out. I was one of about a dozen who were taken into a side alley. This was October. It was quite cold. We were made to strip down to our underpants. And then a big burly sergeant came along the line, and these were all men, by the way, all men. Big burly sergeant came along the line, put his hands in our underpants, grabbed our testicles, and squeezed them until we screamed. There's nothing we could do. In those days, the police were a law unto themselves. We couldn't complain. It was pointless. There was no independent police complaints procedure. Any time we'd in the past tried to complain against police brutality, we'd been given the brush off. So we had to just lump it. Anyway, we were sent on our way, and we decided, well, we made our point, but the landlord still hasn't served us. We'll go back again next week. And we went back again next week, and the whole thing happened all over again. And then we decided to go to all the other pubs in the local area as well and do exactly the same thing. So dozens and dozens and dozens of us were detained or arrested. But in the end, the landlords got the message. It was more hassle for them to not serve us than it would be to serve us, because their straight customers were turning away, because every night there was a commotion. Every night when we went there were arrests, the pub was taken over, became overcrowded with all us lot. So by and large, in the end, the landlords decided it wasn't worth all the hassle. So the landlords gave in and we won. And we replicated that at many bars and restaurants all across London in the coming months. But it shows an example of how direct action and civil disobedience can change things. Sometimes when people in power won't listen, when they ignore reasoned argument and they ignore a moral appeal, sometimes direct action and civil disobedience is necessary. That was also very much the tactic of the LGBT direct action group Outrage, which was formed in 1990. It was sort of a successor of the Gay Liberation Front. Very similar ideas and tactics. So among the various things we did was organize a kiss-in Piccadilly Circus. This was in 1990, 1991. In that period, in that era, a same-sex couple could be arrested, convicted, and fined for merely holding hands or giving each other a kiss or a cuddle in a public place. So it's a very famous case of two lesbians. One lived in Brighton. Her girlfriend went to see her off at Victoria Station, catch the train. They gave each other a good night, kiss and cuddle, and they were arrested. They were arrested under the Public Order Act, which had a clause which said it's an offence to engage in behaviour that is likely to cause harassment, alarm, or distress. This legislation was originally introduced to combat football hooliganism and street rioting. But that phrase was subsequently used primarily to arrest same-sex couples for merely expressing affection. Not for having sex, just for expressing affection. So we decided to hold a mass kiss-in Piccadilly Circus to challenge the police and to challenge the law. We announced it about 3 weeks in advance and said to the police, we're holding this kiss-in. If you think this law is worth defending, come and arrest us all. And then in the intervening period, we got same-sex couples who'd been victims of this police action to tell their stories in the media, on TV, radio, and in the press. And we found that even many people who were perhaps not entirely sympathetic towards LGBT issues were quite horrified that, a sweet lesbian or gay couple would get arrested and get convicted and fined for merely expressing affection. So public opinion turned very rapidly against the police. So much so that on the day of the kiss-in, 1 hour before it was due to begin, I received a message from the police chiefs at New Scotland Yard to say that from that moment onwards, no same-sex couple would be arrested in the London metropolitan area for merely expressing affection. So we won before we even began. And that kiss-in was a huge, joyous celebration. A celebration that we had defeated the Metropolitan Police, that they had caved in and recognized that they were interpreting the law or enforcing the law in an unjust way. Outrage did many other things like that. So to challenge homophobia in the church, in 1994, we stood on the steps of the General Synod of the Church of England in London with placards naming 10 Anglican bishops and calling on them to tell the truth about their sexuality. We were not outing them because they were gay and in the closet. It was because they were part of a church which was overtly homophobic, biphobic, and transphobic. They were aligned to a church which was saying that LGBT people were sinful and must repent, and they were part of a church that was endorsing legal discrimination against the LGBT community. So we felt it was really important to call out these people because there was a clear hypocrisy. They were gay in private, but aligned with an anti-gay church in public. So it was their hypocrisy and their homophobia that we were targeting. There was, of course, a huge furore when we did this. I was personally denounced by the media and politicians as, quote, a gay fascist, a homosexual terrorist, and many, many other things. But the upshot of that action was, as far as I know, not a single one of those 10 bishops ever again said anything anti-gay in public. And because of the huge public furore, which we made clear was our response not only to the homophobia of the church and the hypocrisy of those bishops, but also to the church's refusal to engage with the LGBT community. The Church of England policy is, we don't talk to queers. They didn't use that word, but that was the inference. They would not dialogue even with lesbian and gay Christians. So we made that point after we named those bishops, and that was very embarrassing. It made the church look very, very intolerant. People said, well, I can understand them not agreeing with you, but not even being willing to dialogue. That's unreasonable. So the upshot was that the then Archbishop of Canterbury agreed that there would be a dialogue between his church and the LGBT community for the very first time. On top of that, about a month later, or just over a month later, the House of Bishops was due to meet, LGBT issues were not on the agenda. But because of our naming of those bishops, it was very definitely on the agenda. And it resulted in the church making one of its strongest ever declarations against anti-LGBT discrimination. So we had 3 wins from that action, 3 positive outcomes. I think it was entirely justified. Some years later, 4 years later in 1998, we did something similar, slightly different though. We went into the pulpit of the Archbishop of Canterbury on Easter Sunday 1998 to call him out over his public advocacy of discrimination against LGBT people. He wasn't merely saying that gay people are sinners and should repent. He was saying that the law should discriminate, that LGBT people are not entitled to equal rights, that there should be discrimination in terms of the age of consent, that LGBT couples were unfit to be foster carers or adoptive parents, that there should be no legal recognition of same-sex relationships, and so on and so on and so on. So we didn't interrupt the sacred parts of the service. We waited until Dr. Carey began his sermon, and then we calmly walked towards the pulpit. There were 6 of us from Outrage. I was one of them. As we approached the pulpit, there were 3 church wardens standing nearby. And obviously, we didn't want to get into any physical altercation with them. So one of our members had a brainchild. As we were walking, he suddenly feigned an asthma attack and began gasping for breath and falling to the floor. And of course, all the church wardens rushed over to help him, which gave us an easy path to walk straight up into the pulpit. So I walked up, stood in the pulpit next to the Archbishop. He was quite surprised to see me, but he stood to one side and gave me the pulpit. So I simply said that homophobia was not a Christian value, that the Archbishop was wrong to endorse legal discrimination, that we wanted a church that was inclusive and respecting of equality. Being Easter Sunday, of course, the whole service was being televised around the world, but it was also a big civic occasion. So in the front rows of the cathedral were not only the Archbishop's leading clerics, but also the leading civic figures, the mayor, leading councillors, and the chief of police and his senior officers. So they jumped out of their seats and then came into the pulpit. I was delivering my alternative sermon and hadn't noticed them. I was holding on to the front of the pulpit like this and to steady myself. And the next thing I knew was that some arms came around my waist and yanked me very quickly, sharply. So I was holding on to the pulpit, and the sad fact is that the part of this ancient, historic, medieval pulpit came away in my hands. Anyway, I was arrested and spent the next 6 hours in the cells at Canterbury Police Station while they tried to figure out what to charge me with. They arrested me, but they didn't know what to charge me with. I had to come back some weeks later where they announced they were going to charge me, quote, with indecent behaviour in a church contrary to the Ecclesiastical Courts Jurisdiction Act of 1860. Under this law, any interruption of a minister of religion in a church is deemed to be, quote, indecent. So I didn't drop my trousers or anything like that. I was just interrupting the minister. When it came to my trial, the magistrate accepted that I had behaved politely. I hadn't abused the Archbishop or the Christian faith. The protest was peaceful. He accepted all of that. But he said the law in this case is very, very, very inflexible. There are no ifs and no buts. There's no excuses, no exonerating circumstances. The church has absolute protection in law. You cannot do this without committing a criminal offence. So he found me guilty. He could have fined me £5,000 and sent me to prison for 6 months, but he announced that the penalty would be a fine of £18.60. His comical reference to the 1860 Act, under which I had been convicted. Again, the upshot was positive. This time we made the point that the Archbishop himself had not met with the lesbian and gay Christian movement. So very soon afterwards, when that got all in the press, got lots of press coverage, why hasn't the Archbishop met them? Many of the Christians in the LGBT movement are themselves Anglicans. They belong to Dr. Carey's church. He was so embarrassed that he did agree to meet them for the first time. On top of that, many bishops say they weren't aware that the Archbishop was actively campaigning in Parliament against equality and in favour of homophobic discrimination. And this prompted some of them, not all of them, but some of them, to make public statements that they, as Church of England bishops, did not condone discrimination against LGBT people. They supported legal equality. So again, there are those two big gains, two positive outcomes from those actions. And so the whole history of the battle for LGBT rights has been about those kinds of protests and behind-the-scenes lobbying. You need both. We've just been celebrating the 100 years of some women getting the vote, the battle of the suffragists and the suffragettes. The suffragettes did direct action like the Gay Liberation Front and Outrage, or rather, the Gay Liberation Front and Outrage did direct action like the suffragettes, and the suffragists were behind the scenes lobbying to pressure Parliament. You need both. But it's often the direct action that raises public awareness of an issue and puts the authorities under pressure. That was our strategy. We saw direct action as a way of getting news coverage of LGBT issues, thereby generating a public debate, but also putting people in power under pressure to change. And that's exactly how it worked out. That's how we got from there to here. Thank you.